I think it's time for me to open discussion on the floor, and if any questions, you could, I think, get to the aisles and introduce yourself and direct questions to any of the panelists. Thank you.
For highlighting the relativity and contextuality of extremism, and you gave the example of Turkey. So among countries, we would also take recognition of the fact that it is also relative over time. What my grandmother and my mother used to do, used to wear, the joget that they do today would be considered as totally un-Islamic. So over time also it is relative. The second thing about extremism, you highlighted extremism in the other faith, the right-wing evangelists of Christianity, the Buddhist monks in Rakhine, the Hindus under the BJP in India, and the Sri Lankans. One of the things that make them quite different from the Muslim would be, well, they are as violent as we have described. I mean, the evangelists are supporting this war, but that support is from behind the scenes, whereas the Muslim extremists, they are terrorists that go on suicide bombs and kill people. So they are more media worthy that way. So they are sensational. I think you use the word mindless manifestation there, so maybe that's what they meant. But another difference I can see is they are pan-global. The Muslim terrorists don't just restrict themselves to just a country like the Hindus under BJP. India is just in India. They don't exert the influence to other countries. And I was wondering, do we have examples of extremism without violence? Other religious extremists who are peaceful and not violent?
And just to add a bit on
Your name, please.
Stephen. Now, Dr. Chandra mentioned about evangelists. I think I want to just correct that little word evangelist, which has been misunderstood, especially in the Muslim world. The word evangelist simply means somebody who bears good news, right? So I think Dr. Billy Graham, for example, is an evangelist, is a well-known evangelist. Now, when you mention evangelist, it's quite dangerous because especially in Malaysia, when we talk about evangelists, coming to Malaysia, there's always that connotation of a crusade, that kind of thing, which is not really what it's supposed to be. And also the word evangelical, I basically consider myself as an evangelical Christian, right? I stick to the Bible, I just read the Bible, and I just believe what the Bible says, right? And it doesn't mean that we are involved in extremism, And I think the third point I want to mention is that what Dr. Narima mentioned just now. The reason why certain form of extremism gets more publicity is because it is newsworthy, and that's the way how the media works. A dog bites a man, it's not going to get carried in a newspaper. But if a man bites a dog, that's news. If an accident happens and a person dies, that's news. If a person doesn't die, that's not news. I used to provide footage for TV3, and the first question that the editor asks is, did anyone die in the accident? That's what it is, what news is all about. So it's not really so much on this is just my personal opinion, my personal response to Dr. Chandra, that to some extent it is not the media to be blamed. It is the way how the media works. It's not because the Americans try to create impressions about the Muslim world and so on. It is the way how the media works in general, even in Malaysia. And one final question that I just want to ask is this. Our doctor here mentioned us about joget being un-Islamic. Now, I raised a question recently about Muslims consulting BOMO, and the Tengku Mahkota Johor did something very interesting on his video, and that stimulates a lot of thinking. Are Muslims supposed to be consulting BOMOs and practicing what they call ilmu kabal? Is it that something that has to be addressed as well? Because if you're going the wrong way, you'll be going like the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Although they're supposed to be Christians, open inverted commas, but they're going the wrong path. So I think that should be the way how we look at things. It's not so much of Muslim being extremists, but it's the extremist group that considers themselves as Muslims, or call themselves Muslim, nominal Muslims, who are actually going the wrong path. And they are the ones who are causing problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have one last question before?
My name is Hamza. I'm interested actually in geopolitics, but being a Muslim, I'm also interested in any discussion that deal with Islamic matters. Yeah? Now, there are a few things that I want to make my points, not so much to provide a rejoinder, but perhaps to keep us thinking of the topic that we are addressing today. Firstly, I think Dr. Chandra, who happened to be my guru and also my friend, gave a very good definition distinguishing extremism from sectarianism. But I just want to make one point, I think, with regard to people's perception as it is in the press, yeah? Media, although sometimes people say that you don't fault the media for everything. The way it is treating Islamic extremism gives the impression that every Muslim is an extremist. There are bad Muslim, good Muslim, bad Christian, criminal Christians. There are 1.6 billion Muslims. The number who have conducted probably extremist activities, kill people, all kind of things, you must have said that happen, would be less than 10,000 or 100,000. Even if just 100,000, less than 10% of the entire population. Now, why is that the focus on this small group of people rather than talking about the bigger thing, number one? Number two, I think we must also look at in the proper context of the issues. For example, give you 2 or 3 examples. The first example is which is nearest to our place. What is happening to political Islam in South Thailand, for example? Why is that the Muslims in South Thailand are taking up weapons against the government in Bangkok? You go back to history, 1909, Britain actually gave the territories, Muslim territories, to Great Britain. 1946, after the end of the war, 45. What did Japan do? Japan handed them back to Great Britain, after consulting Great Britain, to Bangkok. They could have been independent state. And they were independent state way back into the 11th century. Okay. So that is the context. Number two, what happened in South Philippines, for example, an area which I have done some work into it. These Muslims, 4 to 5 million of them, have been asking for an autonomy, for a state of their own since 1521, when the Spaniards colonized what we call the Philippines. And they have existed as a state. So this is why, for example, you have to understand the extremist quote-unquote activities of these people who call themselves Muslim, simply because for various reasons, yeah? And most one of the reasons is that they have been suppressed for too long of conflict. Number two, the word Muslim world. Sorry, I'm not trying to dispute what is written here. Give me what I'm suggesting. There are Muslims who have been badly treated in non-Muslim world. This is what I think people must understand. In Europe, for example, it's not a Muslim world. There are Muslims in Europe. But why is that there's so much anger against Muslims? There's a study done by this Amnesty International, published, I think, 2012. It's called something to do with prejudices. And it gives details why Muslims are taking up or being angry with the Western world. The study was done in 5 states: France, Belgium, UK, Germany, and one more state I can't remember. It tells us that one, Muslims are not being treated as Muslim. Second-class citizen, no jobs. They are not allowed even to manifest their identity. You can't wear your hijab. They can do this, they can do that. No, what do you expect of these people? In France, classic. I mean, those who have been visit France, you know it for sure. You know? So these are the things that I think we have to put in perspective when look at the Islamic extremism, the way it is being portrayed in the West. Now, I go back to history a bit. If you look into the Islam versus Christianity, what we call this conflict in the past, went back, I mean, not only to the Crusade, but long before that. There was an attempt to suppress Islam. You know, went back into history kind of thing. So that continues, and I think, to manifest itself. Now, who do we blame? Muslim? Do we blame the Christian, or what? I think we have to blame the environment also that has to do with this kind of problem. No. And then you look at somebody who has done some work, say, the work of Orientalists, for example. Look at the very influential people who have been writing. I mean, Chandra would agree with me. The work of Bernard Lewis, distinguished, very distinguished professor, who rose actually, who made his living through writing about Islam. After 9/11, turned to become so much anti-Islam. Huntington happened to be a professor of mine at Harvard. Same thing. Wrote badly about Islam, the clash of civilization. So Islam has become some sort of an enemy in this country, in these people, and become what I call it the food, you know, that they serve at the table in British or in Western countries. So I would like actually to appeal to some people who to understand Islam in a much broader way. Because to me, Islam is not the problem. The problem lies with bad Muslims, politicians, and power craziness. You alluded to, Chandra, just now between this, the Wahhabis plus what you call this Shia. What happened in the Middle East truly is a proxy war. But even, that worries me, the Sunni group, they are fighting each other. I think that is more tribalism than Islam per se. So we're not going to get any much. I mean, once we put this in a perspective, I think we would have a better understanding of how the world is being shaped by forces beyond our control. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the questions and comments. I'll try to be brief. From Dr. Narima, the couple of issues which were touched by some of the other persons who intervened, and I'll deal with that in the context of my replies to them. But the one thing which I thought one should respond to in your case is you asked whether religious extremism can happen without violence. There are many instances where there is extremism without violence. If you look at the Takfiri movement within Islam, for instance, not all of them are violent. In fact, many of them are not, except they hold attitudes which are extreme. But those attitudes don't express themselves through violence. For instance, attitudes pertaining to female attire, male-female interaction, about cinemas. Some of these attitudes are extreme, but they're not violent. We have examples of that in Malaysia itself. A lot of extreme attitudes expressed via religion are not violent in Malaysia. So that is a phenomenon that does happen. Now, Stephen, you had a couple of comments and questions. Now, in my presentation, I'd said that there are all sorts of evangelists. I'd said that already in my presentation itself. So I was not saying that the term evangelists means only a particular type of evangelist, people who indulge in a certain type of politics and so on. I made that very, very clear. In fact, one of the books I'd used, I'd written a review of a book by a leading evangelist. I don't know whether you've heard the name of Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace, evangelist, very, very progressive, who wrote this book called The Soul of Politics. And I'd used it in my classes when I was teaching many years ago. So I know that there are different types of evangelists, but that term is a term that has to be used nonetheless. Just as in certain circumstances, you'll have to say, for instance, well, that person is a Hindu. It doesn't mean that you're saying that all Hindus are of that particular type. You just have to use that term as a way of describing a particular situation. So that is all that one is saying. I know that there are evangelists and evangelists. That distinction I'm very aware of. But your point about, Muslims, they do certain things, becomes newsworthy. You gave the example of dog biting the man and the man biting the dog and so on. I think it is a little off tangent. Because if you look at the realities, this is also in response to Dr. Narima. You have to ask yourself this question. Why is it when 2,000 mainly Muslims are massacred in Gujarat, 2002, right? That doesn't become headlines. Some people talk about it. There's some reporting. Immediately after that, it is forgotten. But this was an organized massacre involving powerful political forces. It doesn't have that sort of impact because the victims were Muslims. That's the reason. So don't sort of just say that it's because it's a question of whether it's newsworthy or not. There are numerous examples of things happening at the same time, one involving a Muslim, the other one involving a non-Muslim. But you'll find that in the case of the Muslim, it is highlighted. But in the case of the non-Muslim, it is not highlighted. Let me give you a second example. As you age, sometimes these things take a little bit of time coming back to the forefront of your memory. You remember this other incident? Many of you may not remember this. Happened at the same time. There was this case in Nigeria of a Muslim woman who was treated very badly, to put it politely, and there were all these fanatics who were against her sort of being an apostate or, seen as an apostate and so on. There's headlines everywhere. At the same time, mind you, there was this case of a Hindu woman, educated woman, who was made to jump onto the funeral pyre of her husband. That is an example of what? Extremism, of religious fanaticism, but that was not highlighted at all. It was reported, this is why we came to know about it, but it was never highlighted. I would consider that as far worse than what had happened to that woman who in the end, the charges were cleared and the whole thing was over. But you look at the way in which things are treated. I think we have to start from the right premises. As the late Edward Said, you would have heard this name, said a number of times, notably in his book called Covering Islam, he had also written about it in Orientalism. The late Edward Said, not a Muslim, mind you, he's a Christian, Palestinian Christian. He made this point over and over again, that Islam and Muslims are a problem for the West. And because it's a problem for the West, it's a problem for the whole world, because the West controls the world's mind. They control the discourse, they control the media, they control the way in which people are perceived, events are perceived. This is their power. This is the power of the West over the minds of everyone. And this, I think, is something that one has to come to terms with. So let's not try to sort of camouflage the issue and so on. Deal with it. Deal with it. Because in the course of dealing with it, you're going to say, look, there are also things that Muslims do that we don't approve of. But we want Buddhists and Hindus and Christians to stand up and say, we don't approve of these things amongst our fellow religionists. It has been so difficult for me in the last few years, because I'm involved in interfaith dialogue and so on, as you may know, Stephen, yeah? It has been so difficult for me to get Christians to take a position against these narrow-minded Christians who support war, ethnic cleansing, and all the rest of it. They do not want to take a position. 20 years ago, it was easier. Now they don't want to. Why? Because they know that these narrow-minded Christians have a constituency. They're powerful, and they don't want to antagonize them. But when Muslims adopt a similar attitude, they don't want to antagonize fellow Muslims, they'll say, look at these Muslims. When Christians do the same thing, no one says anything. So I hope you as a Christian and an evangelist, they do speak up. Stand up, speak up. That is what really counts in the end. Now, this, I think, actually underscores this critical point about what is really at work here. In the end, it's not a question of good Muslims, good Christians, bad Muslims, bad Christians, good Hindus, bad Hindus, and so on. These are just manifestations. Ultimately, we have to deal with the question of power. At the root of all these things, and I'm not simplifying things, and I'm not generalizing, power plays a very big role. If we don't recognize that, we will not be able to come up with solutions. Hegemony, which is dominance and control, that's what it means, hegemony, plays a very big role. At the global level, it plays a very big role at the domestic level. Hegemony in national politics. Hegemony perhaps even at the level of the kampung. That's hegemony, control, dominance. Hegemony in the relations between men and women. Hegemony. So hegemony, power, this is what really matters. This is what one must try to understand. So once you understand that, I think everything else falls into place. And very quickly, the question that Dr. Hamza raised about context and history, I agree with you completely. I think this is very, very important. History, context. You can't talk about relations between communities, extremism, sectarianism, and so on, without understanding the context. If, for instance, one did not know the context of the history of the 3 provinces in the southern part of Thailand, or what had happened in the Philippines, as you pointed out, and then you come to conclusions like, oh, look at these fanatics, they cannot live with other people. It's Samuel Huntington. You remember that famous line in his infamous article where he says, Islam has got bloody borders. And I don't know whether you know that I debated with him at the University of Malaya when he came here in 1996. Sorry? Yeah, he was a Harvard, but you should have seen your teacher being demolished by another of your teachers. So we just demolished Samuel Huntington. You see, where Huntington was holding on to this view, he said, Islam has got bloody borders. I said, every instance that you talk about, where Islam, you say, has got bloody borders, Muslims have been victims. He gave the example of Kashmir. Islam has bloody borders. He says, Bosnia, that was the worst example that he could give. Bosnia, the Muslims, they are the troublemakers in these areas and so on. I said, look, it doesn't hold at all. And then he talked about 2,000 years of Chinese history. That's this other bugbear, Islam and Chinese civilization. 2,000 years, the Chinese, he said, they've been trying to dominate the world. I said, for God's sake, most of the 2,000 years, the Chinese have actually confined themselves to their borders. If you look at Chinese history, there are very brief periods that they went out to the world. So I thought this person, quite a problem. Well, bless his soul, he's dead now, Samuel Huntington, yeah? And of course, I don't want to talk about Bernard Lewis. Samuel Huntington took the title of his article from Bernard Lewis's writing. That's another character. So we have to deal with these guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Jalan?
Yeah. Let me just add to a couple of points. One, the issue of evangelical Christianity and Christians not being engaged in the direct way that, say, Muslims would be carrying out acts of terror or violence. I think there's ample evidence, certainly historically, but even in the modern period. I think Dr. Chandra mentioned the book God's Army in reference to even within this context of the war in Iraq, where clearly active recruitment of the U.S. military in those parts of the U.S. South that I'm very familiar with, on the basis of the Bible and Christianity and mobilization based on that. And this has been well documented now in recent times. And I think beyond that, the discussion actually beyond that is that there certainly has taken place a secularization process in the Western world. But that process has not affected the level of violence enacted upon the rest of the world. Whether that violence is done in the name of Christianity or in the name of the U.S. military, it doesn't really make a difference to the victims who die because of those bombs and the drones and the cluster and the napalm and the so on and so forth. So as Dr. Chandra was saying, whether it's the millions in Vietnam or elsewhere, they've been victims, but clearly there has been religious discourse at times, even in modern times, where in the Western world, if you want to argue its role has played less than in the Muslim world, it's still, religious discourse is mobilized. The Lord's Army in Uganda, another great example. All that type of violence enacted in the name of Christianity. So you can find the evidence there if you want to. I live, where I've lived in the US, in Virginia, with this discussion about evangelical Christianity, prevalent. I have a lot of evangelical friends. And every day at the locker room of the YMCA, me and my daughter would go swimming. And every day in the locker room, I would hear the same thing. Oh, we have to endure this president who's both a Muslim and a socialist. For 4 years, just nonstop, a Muslim, socialist. Finally, I said, I wish he was a Muslim and a socialist, but you guys can continue thinking that he is. I mean, so this is the context. If you really want to go take a trip to the deep south of the US, many good evangelicals, but of course, many of them cheerleaders of every single war that the US wants to wage abroad, and that's the problem that you confront there. And besides that, I mean, if you want to talk about the internal wars within even Christianity itself, the entire war in the 1980s that was waged in Central America, a big portion of that was just being waged against basically the Catholic Church in Latin and Central America, because the Catholic Church had endorsed the preferential option for the poor, liberation theology. And so that's what that was being waged. The Vatican was supporting it, so on and so forth. So these things happen even within Christianity as well. The other thing I would say that I would affirm what Dr. Chandra was saying, extremism does not necessarily have to take a violent form. The largest Islamic revivalist group in the world since the early part of the 20th century is a group known as the Tablighi Jamaat. Largely non-violent. I mean, they've been trying to trace, some Tablighi Jamaat members have gone by. But it's been a largely non-violent group, apolitical group, largest Islamic revivalist group throughout the Muslim world. And the final thing I will say, someone mentioned Islam as the enemy. Clearly, that the ideology of empire and hegemony today relies on a very vicious form of Islamophobia. That is the way you mobilize and convince your population to engage in horrific crimes abroad, because people are not, born as horrible human beings. So the ideology of Islamophobia to dehumanize and to portray another population of the world, another faith, the culture, civilization, as barbaric, medieval, and to be feared and hated, is the way you then mobilize your own population to then wage war against them. So Islamophobia is certainly the ideology right now being used to mobilize empire against large parts of the Muslim world. But we have to be careful when we say that, Islam is the enemy. And I particularly say this to Muslim audiences, also when I'm speaking in Pakistan. Because at the same time, the closest ally of the United States for the past 5 decades has been the regime of Saudi Arabia. So how does that make sense? The most fundamental, quote-unquote, fundamentalist regime in the Muslim world that has done so much damage, arguably for me, most damage to the Muslim Ummah, is the closest ally of the United States. So that should at least, that simple fact should compel us to look a bit deeper into the question of where this extremism and this violence is coming from. Thank you.
Can I have a couple of questions before close session? Someone just now?
We don't have much time, but I think we must look at it also from different perspective. The extreme and sectarian views of the Islamic community, as where Muslims are majority, what is the effect on the non-Muslim community is practically unknown, right? But what I know is that it is starting to feel and develop their own extremist views, right? From the Buddhist perspective, at least, let me start in Malaysia. The level of separation now is becoming bigger. Oh, I'm Buddhist, you are Muslim, and they are extremists. we need to protect ourselves. So these views are starting to build. And this is, I think, when we talk about response to extremism, right, we are also building extremism in different ways. And if you expand this a little bit further to, say, to Myanmar, Sri Lanka, right? Now, some interesting developments. Both the extremist groups of Viratu and Nyanaskara in Sri Lanka, they have come together and formed some kind of alliance. And right in the middle of the alliance is a target. The target are the Muslims. And that's dangerous, right? And I speak up against that. And I personally, publicly and personally spoken up against it. So no, this is not the way. Because we have not seen the real problems. And I do agree that power is one very major issue that we need to deal with, because each country like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the powers that be are starting or have been manipulating such forces, right? And economics is the other area, because if there's a Muslim majority, then the non-Muslims will see their space become more and more confined. We need to deal with it. So what I'm trying to say is that I think in responding to extremism and sectarianism in Muslim world, we cannot forget, we need to look at it together with the different religious groups as well to understand how we need to collaborate at a very fundamental level. This is my thoughts. So I wonder what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have one last question?
Hello, my name is Khader. You said that the reason why this Western media emphasizes on Muslims as extremists is you said the main issue here is power, right? But I'm wondering, what does the West have to gain from the rest of the world fearing Islam?
All right, thank you.
Well, Vidyas' comment, I'm on the same page with him. I think there's a need for people to work together in addressing this issue, because then you get a more balanced perspective. In other words, if you're confronted with a situation where you have two religious communities or individuals from two different religious communities who are involved, if one can work together, then you will be able to see how the problem expresses itself vis-a-vis one community and how it expresses itself vis-a-vis the other community, and you come up with a common position. Interfaith dialogues do help, but the precondition is this: you must be prepared to deal with the real world. Having interfaith dialogues which are just airy-fairy, saying all the nice things, motherhood type of statements, it is of no use. It's a waste of time. You have to deal with the real issues that challenge all of us. Only then would we be able to move forward. Now, our friend here asked about what does the West have to gain? Is that correct? From sort of portraying Islam in a certain manner. Now, this is a very complex question. If you look at it in terms of the contemporary world, one can argue that it is related to some very tangible issues, why Islam is portrayed in a certain way. To put it very graphically, if West Asia and North Africa, the area which is the world's biggest exporter of oil, if it was selling apples and oranges to the rest of the world, I do not think we would have had some of these problems. It's because it's exporting oil. And the lifeblood of industrial civilization is oil. That is the lifeblood of industrial civilization. And the West is at the head of global industrialization. And this is why this problem has arisen. Because they want to control the arteries that are responsible for oil. They want to make sure that they would be in control. They're not just interested in excess. This is another issue that we should be very clear about, the difference between excess and control. The Chinese want access to the world's oil because they are developing rapidly. They want access, but they don't seek control. They don't seek control. They're not out to control the governments and control the passageways and all the rest of it. In the case of the West, for a very long while, they've always wanted control. Colonialism was about control. In the post-colonial period, it's also about control. Even though they are not running a particular territory anymore, in the old sense, in the conventional sense, they want to control. Which is why they indulge in what is known as regime change, because they want control. Have you ever heard of the Chinese seeking regime change? Even though they're all over the world making trade agreements and oil deals and so on, but they're not looking for regime change. But in the case of the West, they want regime change because they want to make sure they're in control. They're in total control. Chomsky, very well-known global dissident, had said this for a very long while, that they've always seen themselves as the rulers of the world, and they want to continue to rule the world. So they want to be in total control of the situation. This is what it is. You were asking why. Oil, it is related to strategic routes. If you look at the 10 most strategic sea routes in the world, 8 out of the 10 are connected to Muslim countries. Whether you're talking of the Hormuz, Suez, Straits of Malacca, all these are linked to the Muslim world. So that's very important as far as their control is concerned. Strategic routes, oil, the lifeblood of industrial civilization. And yet another factor, since 1948, why that part of the world they're very, very determined to control is because their surrogate, their proxy, the state they created, the artificial state called Israel, it is there. And they want to protect Israel at all costs. They created Israel, the state of Israel. So these are the reasons why there is this attempt to demonize the Muslims and to demonize Islam and so on. Just as a footnote to that, whenever you talk of terrorists, which is something that we are concerned about, you would not have heard terms like Hindu terrorists, Buddhist terrorists, where the religion is linked to terrorism. Now, the West created this terminology, Islamic terrorists. The BBC was the first to use it widely, Islamic terrorists, and since then everyone else has picked it up. Clearly, an attempt to stigmatize the religion. Even if you can show that 9 of the 10 terrorists, if you look at these terrorists and the interrogation and so on, a lot of them don't know anything about Islam. But it doesn't matter. They are labeled as Islamic terrorists. So there is a conscious attempt to do this. For that reason, the friend who asked this question just now, trade routes, oil. And there's a history behind it. There's a history behind it. If I may say this very quickly, and I hope it would not be misunderstood, I think the only non-Western civilization that has challenged the West is Islam. That's the other reason. You look at it historically. Look at it historically. Hindu civilization has never challenged the West, neither has Buddhist civilization. But in the case of Islam, the way in which Islam spread in the early decades, and it came into that relationship, unfortunately, with the Christian world. And they mastered that one very important factor that was responsible for the rise of the West. They mastered science, which was the reason why it spread so fast and it became so powerful. They mastered science, and Western civilization just couldn't accept this, that there was a challenge to them. See, you should read an article which we had carried in one of our Just publications before, which is quite well known, written by a brilliant diplomat scholar by the name of Erskine Childers. Erskine Childers, Irish, passed away some years ago. He wrote an article called Amnesia and Antagonism. That's the title of the article, Amnesia and Antagonism, where he shows that the West has gone out of the way to erase Islam's contributions to science, for instance, because it is something that just can't accept, that this is actually the history. If you look at almost every major branch of science. You look at physics, you look at algebra, you look at, trigonometry, you look at the logarithms. Even if you look at, medicine, so much of medicine, for 600 years, the main medical text used in Western universities was Ibn Sina. Yeah? So if you look at all these things, in the West, they don't even acknowledge this, because this is something which makes them feel that somehow they had lost out at a certain point. It's very deep in their psyche. Unfortunately, the Muslims are reacting to this, some of them, the Daesh types and so on. They're doing it in a very stupid way, in a foolish way that makes the situation worse. Those of us who believe in a different sort of world, we think that we should see these things from another perspective. I see all this, the knowledge that has been accumulated through the centuries, through the millennia, as the common heritage of humankind. And if you see it in a very objective way, the Muslims would not have achieved what they did in science if it had not been for the Hindus. Because if you look at the numerals, where did they come from? They came from the Hindus. And look at the contribution of the Chinese to chemistry. Muslims developed chemistry, but it came from the Chinese. So all civilizations borrow from one another. They evolve knowledge, they spread knowledge, and so on. But when you have a certain dominant force which wants to maintain its dominance, they don't want to acknowledge all this. And now you have a group which is unhappy, angry with all this, but they're doing the same thing. They're also imitating them in a sense. We want to fight them in this way, which is foolish. If they used violence, we want to use violence. But it won't get them anywhere. So this is my criticism of not just the dominant centers of power in the West, but also of groups in the Muslim world who are attempting to rectify the situation in a very foolish and in some ways catastrophic manner. Thank you.
Yeah,
I just wanted to add that, if you go by the statements by President-elect Trump now about against Islam and all that, it's very frightening. And what I fear is that he will drive the Muslim world towards supporting China and a China-led multi-hub, multi-partnership system in international relations. Because as I see it, there is an emerging China-led, with the collaboration of Russia, to come up with a multi-hub, multi-partnership to counterbalance the US. And an anti-Islam foreign policy. With a president which has going to be, has expressed publicly his attitude to Islam and not going to admit Muslims anymore into the US. This will drive the Muslim world towards a Chinese-led multi-hub and multi-partnership.
Yeah, just my last remarks. I wanted to affirm what Dr. Chandra was saying, particularly for the historical encounter between Christianity and Islam. For those of you who are interested, one good book is Richard Bullitt's book, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. Again, historically documenting how the antagonisms did not have to take place because there was an incredible amount of borrowing and trade and learning that taking place. And another reference for those folks interested in that encounter is George Saliba's book, Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance. Again, the close linkages between the two. And the final point that I'll make, coming back to one of the points I made in my talk, is, and now with the, I think the revelation that Trump is most likely going to be the president, is what, it is determined? Okay, so it's final. So I think one of the points that may be important here to emphasize, other than just the ridiculousness of this, is that what is going on in the world, not just clearly in the Muslim world, but throughout the world, in the United States. We'd like to say, and this is what I was saying in my talk, we'd like to frame it, and it's convenient for certain forces, powerful forces, to convenient as an issue of ideology-driven violence or religious-driven or theology-based violence. In fact, it may be the opposite. It may, in fact, be the lack of ideology, the lack of alternatives in today's world, that the dominant either secular or religious systems are offering principles and values for decent living on this planet. In fact, this is why we may be seeing the phenomena of this outrageous type of violence that, say, a group like Daesh is offering, these characters like Trump emerging, precisely because of the lack of ideology. The Muslim world, and this is the last thing I'll say, is a good example over the past now 3 to 4 decades. The way, and this is kind of an internal critique for Muslims to have, the way we have been willing to, in some ways, sell ourselves to some form of Islam of the powerful as the flavor of the month, or flavor of the year or of the decade. In the 1980s, it was Islam as jihad, jihadi Islam, against the commies in Afghanistan to serve the purpose of the empire and its client regimes in the Muslim world. That's over, and now all of these guys are now a problem for the empire, so now we need moderate Islam. So now moderate Islam needs to become the flavor of the month, and everyone needs to, and so all of this is about how do we serve the needs of the powerful. And there's no introspection about what is an Islam, what is a religious or a secular system that actually serves the needs of the population and of the poor. Liberation theology in Latin America attempted to do that when it said that our religion would be based upon preferential option of the poor. And I think this is the serious rethink that needs to happen in all philosophy, whether it's of a secular orientation or a religious-based orientation, is that what are we responding to, what type of system and based on what type of values that we can develop and foster to build a better world. And in the absence of that, we get all of this phenomena that we see today.
But obviously we need to, the Muslim world, we have to set up our own agenda. There's a great need for rethinking, re-examination of the Muslim world. And we should set up our agenda rather than reacting and being used by the empire or others.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashant. Yep.
Sorry. Just in relation to what Brother Redzuan had said just now, I think we have come to a point in the 21st century where no religious community, culture, or people can do this alone. I agree with what he has said, but I think we should do it together. It should not be just Muslims. It should be, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Buddhists, everyone. I think we should be able to come together and take up this challenge. And again, if one may, this is not a sales pitch. I think this is why it's so important for us to reflect on what we did as a nation in 1970. We came up with something called the Rukun Negara, which was all-encompassing, it was inclusive, belief in God, a very spiritual concept as the anchor, but the values totally universal, applicable to everyone. We have just set it aside. We've forgotten that, and now we are sort of chasing all sorts of other formulations, when actually we had our own national charter, as it were, just like the Indonesians. But the Indonesians, the big difference? 1945, the Pancasila. They have remained faithful to the Pancasila. In spite of all the changes that Indonesia has undergone, far more radical than what Malaysia has undergone. Indonesia, from first parliamentary democracy, then a guided democracy, then a military dictatorship, and after that a quasi sort of democracy, and now a full democracy. But for them, the national ideology has always been the Pancasila. That, I think, is why it's so important.
Speaking for the G25, we would like to see Ejaz, IRF 25, and other NGOs support the idea of a major national forum to revive the Rukun Negara and to be incorporated into the constitution.
I was in Myanmar last month. I'm going again next week, another 1 month of work in Myanmar. I expressed very, very diplomatically and very, very gently about that, and the movement to take away the Nobel Prize from her. What they told me to defend her is this, and I think I can believe them. She would not want to make open statements because she wanted the votes when she was running for election. But when I was there, because there was one obstetrician who was supposed to come and have a meeting with me, they said she cannot come with you because she's gone to Rakhine, because Aung San Suu Kyi has formed this very important national committee to revive, tolerance towards the Muslim. I don't know whether that is true or not. So she is not talking about it, but she seems to be doing something about it, which reminded me, which made me compare to Tun Mahathir, Dr. Mahathir, when he wanted to Islamize Malaysia and brought in Anwar Ibrahim. He said a lot of things against, he said a lot of things again because dia nak menang kafir, wanted to show us that I'm more Muslim than you. So he was like trying to be very pro-Muslim, but what he did was something else, like about what happened to all those Muslim groups that became illegal, whatever. So I see the opposite of what Aung San Suu Kyi is doing and what Dr. Mahathir did. But let's see what happens. I personally don't think democracy will really come to Myanmar.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Anyway.
Interviewer, she's referring to the interviewer, right?
Yeah, she was interviewing to the interviewer.
Yeah,
She said, I didn't know that she was a Muslim.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Brother Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, Dr. Dato Redzuan, and Brother Jalan as well. And I think I would like to give back the session to Elma before we end up and invite you all for tea after it.
Before we call it a day, in a few words, thank you very much to our honorary guest for the insightful speeches today. It's been very enlightening. Basically, we have all concurred that the existence of extremism and radicalism as it is emerging nowadays in the era of globalization, which is supposed to be actually the contrary, is a prominent threat to our societies, to our peaceful existence, and to the welfare of our countries. So we would like to invite you for refreshments after this, and we thank you for your time. Please keep a pace with us for our future programs, and we will also let you know in return. Thank you so much.